Just a note about today's episode, Rune's audio cuts out in a few instances and we lose a word or two. One case was where Rune listed where you can find him at grimoire-of-geekery.tumblr.com, and all of those links and other references mentioned are available in our show notes at magethepodcast.com. On with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and today my distinguished guest is previous Mage the Podcast guest, Rune Emerson. Rune, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm distinguished.
You are distinguished. I can say that without difficulty. This is something like a paradigm deep dive, but our goal with this episode is to give listeners a toolbox to look at a contemporary magical practice and then walk through the exercise of translating that magical belief into a paradigm, a practice or set of practices, and then finally the instruments to create a total focus. And we have a few examples that we're going to go through. But first off, Rune, why should we trust you when it comes to modern magical practices?
Okay, so I practice. I've been a student of the occult for most of my life. So we're talking 30 years. Anyways, but I've been student of the occult. It's kind of a family thing as well as it's my profession. I teach classes on this. I practice divination and card reading and so on and so forth as a profession as well. I've written a book on the subject. I'm well acquainted with a lot of the practitioners who have written like books for Llewellyn and so on and so forth. I've met a bunch of them, and several of them and I are close friends or contemporaries. So I've kind of got a grab bag view of everything in American magical practice, American occultism, and then I'm an initiate of my own tradition as well. So I'm a practitioner.
And as we often say on Mage the Podcast, our goal here is a start. Our goal here is to give you the basic tools. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to join us in Discord. Rune is there. And even if Rune doesn't necessarily have the answer, Rune will probably be able to direct you where to go. And what would you say the unifying idea is behind the set of modern magical or modern occult practices in the United States?
So here's a problem. And I did mention this the last time so Americans really like to pretend that they know everything about the occult. They really have opinions. I can't tell you what the most popular or common ones are, but I can tell you some common ones. America, being a melting pot of cultures, is also a melting pot of people's various metaphysical philosophies, and almost all of them are badly interpreted. Spiritualism came to America. It didn't originate here. It originated in England, and then it came to America, and then we reinterpreted it drastically and attached it to a bunch of different religions, and it became completely different from what it was in England. Likewise, I mentioned yoga and the various different practices associated with Indian spirituality drastically reinterpreted in America and badly misinterpreted, which they were already being kind of bastardized in England. And then when we got a hold of them through British imperialism and its trade with us.
And one of the messy parts there is it is one of those things where some groups actively want their practices referred to as magic and other ones don't. I think if you were to tell most Catholics, for instance, that their belief in intercessionary prayer or the divinity of the saints is magic, I think a lot of people would be like, no, it's not. So even the term itself is going to be messy. So how about we just say, what do you think are the key practices that you would like to discuss in this framework that we're going to outline today?
So I will be bringing up some of the most common and well understood Western practices. I'm going to stick to the Western practices. I'm not going to go into Eastern practices at all because I am probably not the expert that should be talking about those things.
And as an aside, if you are that expert and you're listening, or you know one, drop us a line, magethepodcast@gmail.com. The Paradigm Deep Dive episodes have been well received, and I would love to expand it beyond the group of people I just happen to know through Facebook and our Discord server. So anyway.
So I'm going to be focusing on things that I've personally interacted with, but not necessarily all the things that I've interacted with are things that I'm initiated into, which we're going to get into in a minute.
Now, to get some basic terms, we are going to use the terms paradigm, practice, and instrument and focus in their mage term. Whenever we say tradition, it's going to be, as Rune said, tradition with a lowercase t, and just be a collection of cultural practices that a group of people or practitioners observe. So nothing crazy there. Whenever we say Hermetic tradition, we are, for the purposes of this episode, unless we say Order of Hermes, we are always referring to real world or contemporary magical practice. So you've made mention of initiate or initiatory arts.
Yes.
What does initiation in this case mean?
Initiation literally means experiencing and being changed by a mystery. Before you ask, a mystery is defined as something you cannot understand unless you've experienced it, and something that you cannot explain. It's generally profound and life-changing, and that is actually at the core of every occult tradition in the world.
So we can kind of make a contrast, things that can be understood through discord, rationality, and reason, and things that are purportedly only understandable through experience, where there is no set of words I can use to describe a phenomenon, but also it is the case that once two people have experienced that phenomenon, they are able to have some discussion about it because they have a shared base of experience.
Right, and actually, that's the whole thing. You can talk about and do discourse on the subject of mysterious practices, mysterious initiatory knowledge, and so on and so forth, gnosis and all of that sort of thing. The thing is, the people who are with you talking about it are not going to be able to understand it unless they themselves have all experienced it. That's kind of the whole point. An explanation of a mystery not only loses cohesion the more you try to follow it, but it also actively causes the people who are listening to have a dissonant experience where they stop trusting you because you sound like a woo-woo. And this is actually the easiest way to explain the concept of, like, the human concepts of mystery. Don't have anything to do with occultism at all. They just have to do with universal human experiences like love. If you've ever had an interaction with somebody who talks about having children, how they have had children and what it was like for them, if you've not ever given birth or had a child or helped to, create a child in this world, you don't know what they're talking about. You can only intuit and try to kind of like empathize and sympathize. You can try to come to a conclusion based on exterior objective influence. But even with that, you're not going to know what it is to be a mother. You're not going to know what it is to be a father. There are a lot of different possible experiences you can have within that mystery category that a person outside cannot comprehend no matter how you explain it to them.
Now, this is interesting because the philosopher L.A. Paul talks about transformative experiences, and the thought experiment that is used there is turning into a vampire, where the experience of being a vampire is fundamentally different than the human experience. So how does one evaluate whether or not one should go through a transformative experience? Because the person appraising that choice out the other side is going to be fundamentally different than the person who approached it. So when one is looking at a mystery, what are the processes and tools that a community uses? Because I assume there's also some power to this mystery. Like, otherwise we wouldn't be using it as a magical process. What kind of tools does a group use to say, is this a person who we want to give access to this secret and possibly terrible knowledge?
Well, and see, that's kind of one of the big arguments of the occult community, because nobody agrees on how one evaluates that particular situation and whether or not they're right, which is why you have a whole lot of like creepers, predators in the occult community who used what they learned for really horrible reasons. And in some cases, the teachers who brought them to whatever or body of knowledge they had regret what happened and will show that by repudiating or excommunicating them from whatever lineage or tradition they're a part of. But also some of them won't, because they recognize that there's not a whole lot of control they have over certain things. Because fundamentally, and this is one of the things to understand about mysteries, is mysteries exist whether or not humans validate them. Mysteries exist. Most of the body of occult knowledge that any lineage or tradition follows was a trial and error type thing, bent around trying to digest, process, and then turn into an applicable practice a set of mysteries that they became exposed to. A good example of a modern version of this is Reiki, which is very, very prevalent, just like it's everywhere now. Considering that it was a practice derived from various forms of shiatsu and then faith healing in Japan, you run into it everywhere. The way that they talk about the man who originated it, Usui, he had visionary experiences very much same vein as like Moses, Jesus, and his healing practices, which involve laying on of hands, faith-based and also chi-based, and a different kind of basically a reinterpretation of healing. Some traditions, some lineages of that are very Christianized, and they think that it was kind of like healing art that was lost that Jesus practiced. That articulation and all of those different trappings, different like ways of talking about it, and different technologies that people have put together to teach the practice, the sigils, the symbols, the attunements, all of that was meant to digest what Usui brought to his first students. It was just meant to help process it out and unpack it.
So the idea here is that a visionary practitioner has direct access to a fundamental truth that allows them to manipulate the world around them, but may not have a system or framework that explains it.
Right. Now, in Mage the Ascension, so we have an interesting comparison here. In Mage the Ascension, they made it so that, yes, you had magicians who awakened independent of a tradition, but you also had tradition-oriented, and I'm using the big T tradition right now, tradition-oriented initiatory practices which woke people were supposed to. Like the Hermetics have this whole like series of training that you go through that slowly teach you things. And if you happen to already have a magical awakening and an active avatar, you will get bumped up in your training. So like you're not on level 1, you're on 3. And they do that to try to streamline and focus your awakening into a hermetic traditional mage's awakening in their practice. Verbena have very experiential, bloody kind of rituals that expose people directly to the mysteries themselves, rather than try to streamline them entirely. Oftentimes they're more experiential, and so they don't bother explaining anything at all, and they don't teach you anything at all, or any way that you know, until after it's over, which is a thing.
So if we can jump back, a social commentary, I find it interesting that we have found almost every ancient or at least old culture had some sort of ritual where someone had a shamanic experience in the sense that they gained access to an experience or a substance that allowed them to see other things. And
Yes.
part of the goal of the priestly caste was to say, Bob's not ready, but Sally is. Let's let Sally do that.
Right.
And through most of the 20th century, we have been intensely restrictive on who society and law allowed access to it. Then you had people who believed that everyone should gain access to it, and you had something like Timothy Leary saying everyone should try LSD. And now you have people doing weed and CBD, and the pendulum of permissiveness has swung back very far to people saying everyone should be allowed access to these substances all the time. And now the pendulum may be swinging back as we realized, okay, we have people with the medical knowledge to say, yes, this is how to take this, but not necessarily with the spiritual knowledge to say, this is how you should understand what this experience is.
Well, and I actually encountered that the argument of substance use for the purposes of awakening and opening the mind in the occult community before I ever encountered the medical side of it. The biggest argument in the 90s and then the early 2000s in the occult community was, don't use drugs in your rituals unless you're specifically like the people who are telling each other do it are a part of an ecstatic tradition. Like the Lama occasionally experimented to a degree. The early Gardnerians did, and then later did not, and then we're actually rather firm about that. And you run into like ecstatic traditions like Anderson Fairy and people of the radical fairy traditions and stuff, which are more of a political tradition, and chaos magic and so on and so forth. The idea was, don't work with those until you've already had a valid experience with them, so that you know that it is actually a valid experience and not just your brain chemistry being affected by a little green thing.
Oh, interesting. So you're essentially saying you can take a helicopter to the top of the mountain, but only after you've proven that you can hike to the top of the mountain.
Right. Only after you've proven to your own mind that the top of the mountain exists, should you be using shortcuts to get there.
You said a lot of very dense and important things in there. So you actually posit an interesting thing, that the visionary practitioner, the first person to do a thing, they have paradigm, they have a understanding, they have a belief in how the world works, and they have an instrument. They have the thing they do to deliver change to the world, but they do not have a practice. So the first person who did Reiki is almost a spontaneous generator of a magical paradigm where they say it is possible for humans to act in such a way as to allow the divine to cause healing, and the agent of healing is my hands or these actions. But they did not yet have that infilled framework that says this is the how-to. And it took other practitioners to go back and actually fill out the idea of practice.
Well, and you're right about filling out practice, but you should also acknowledge filling out of instruments as well, because the thing is, like your founder, your Gnostic visionary person, their epiphany gave them a direct method by which they could do something as part of it. So that is a practice, and then that does move into an instrument. In this case, it would just be the laying on of hands. And then maybe he developed some stuff himself to that, but still didn't really understand what he was developing as he started teaching. And this is actually very common in most human technology. When you teach it, you learn it better. And so he was reinventing the wheel. He didn't realize he was reinventing the wheel, but he was. And then once he finished doing that, he was like, oh, wait, that's a wheel. And he was able to extrapolate from other technology that he already had and then add to the practice, which is why you run into people who practice Reiki who use chakra therapy. They use a truncated Western version of chakra therapy because that's not how any of that works. They don't realize that they're kind of following a long tradition of borrowing from other cultures that and then not understanding them properly and then just using them. But they will use crystal grids, they will use power stones, they will use prayer, they will use various different things that are used in other traditions of faith healing, other traditions of, and I'm putting quotations around this, energy work and light work and so on and so forth that have been around in Western thought as you could study it for probably about 100 years, so maybe longer even. So we have access to all this sort of that we can just throw in and go, oh, that makes sense. In the same way that a chef who learns a particular recipe in a particular culture and then tastes it and goes, this could use some chives, and then throws some chives in. That's how traditions develop, how paradigms develop, and why nowadays in this age of information, modern practitioners oftentimes are incredibly eclectic. They often make their own practices, and their practices work perfectly well. And that's actually something that a lot of mage practitioners play when they play the game. Like, they have their own way of learning stuff and their own identity and their own way of doing things, and they don't know whether that means that they should or should not sign up for, say, the Order of Hermes, or have their character be like a dream speaker.
Mage also often creates this paradox. It's not quite the same as hubris, but in one level, it is the ultimate expression of orthodoxy to say, these are the ways that one changes the world that I have learned from my culture, and also the ultimate statement of heterodoxy by saying, I have transcended these tools and I now know how to change reality directly.
That's actually what that whole section in the book on focus is about. Once you reach an arete of 4, I think it was, you can start to remove certain tools.
Yeah, once you reach arete 3.
I've actually encountered this a lot in modern occultism, so I'm over here having a little chortle, while reading the book, kind of going, oh, the tools versus, the tools, that conversation from 2002. And like, you'll run into this whole thing where it's like, it's a sign of your evolved practice that you can eschew the use of certain practices, of certain tools. You never really stop believing the world is the way it is unless you have a major experience and then something that's kind of traumatic. But that's largely because of your avatar. And I'm over here like, I think that maybe some of the real world occultists need some avatars. Maybe that's what needs to happen. They need someone helping them figure out their magic, because y'all have gotten lost.
One of the comparisons I make is all of us have an intrinsic understanding of the grammar that we speak in our native languages, and every attempt to systematize that is kind of a pale imitation of it.
And it fails,
But it's better than nothing, and it's super handy, especially when you're trying to learn it secondhand.
It's so frustrating because it's useful, but at the same time, it's not. Your results will vary.
Yeah. So let's get some basic terms in the book. These are going to be vitally important going forward, and those are paradigm, practice, and instruments. And the M20 on page 566 gives us how does focus work. And historically in Mage, the idea of what a focus was just a thing you did or a thing you used to change the world. And it has changed across editions. In first edition, it was a contrivance you used to distract sleepers from the fact that really all your magic came from the inside, that your character knew they didn't need their witch's cauldron, but if you did it, sleepers would be more okay with it. In second edition, it became tied to generally cultural practices. In revised, it was kind of training wheels where you could eventually transcend seemingly most aspects of a paradigm, or your paradigm could expand to involve almost all magic. And then in M20, focus is now this multi-part thing that consists of what you believe, your paradigm, the framework you use, or what you do to turn that belief into action, which is the practice, and what does the mage specifically use within that practice, which is your instrument. And when you combine those all together, that is your focus. And I don't know about you, but the line between paradigm and practice and instrument for me gets blurry a lot of the time.
It should.
Yeah. And if you get 2 out of the 3 and you're sitting at my table, that's good enough for me. If you could,
right.
if you could get 2 out of 3. That tends to be
pretty true for us too. Like, I haven't met a mage storyteller who really is a stickler about following focus unless they don't really understand it, because there's a lot of blur with all of this. It all kind of merges into one big kind of thing. Because here, let me give you an example. So your tools are naturally extrapolated tools which help you articulate your practice. Like, for example,
can we do a walkthrough for your Reiki example? So one of the standard ones I do is, if I am a monotheistic religious character who believes that I have the ability to lay hands to heal, the way I define paradigm is, what are the differences between the way you view the world and the way a bog standard sleeper does? And the way I would put that for the laying of hands paradigm is, aspect 1, there is a God, and that God notices our actions. That God has the ability to intercede or grant power to its agents, and is willing to respond to human requests. The practice is intercessory prayer. The idea that through meditation focus, you have a direct access to the divine, and the divine will grant you a portion of its power or allow you to change the world. And this is a case where both of them get you to the same place, but I think it's critical for explaining the world. And then the instrument is prayer and laying of hands. And that is how you do your life 3 or life 4 effect. Now, interestingly, Reiki gets you to the same point, but what would you consider to be the paradigm, practice, and instruments of that? Like, what are the fundamental worldview, the fundamental beliefs that allow Reiki to exist? What is that framework? And finally, what is that instrument?
Okay, so let's go back to paradigm. This is actually the very first step that I wanted to explain to people when they're trying to learn how to shot web. Like, when you're trying to figure out how to cast spells in your game, as a player, as a storyteller, when you're trying to workshop what your NPCs would do, whatever, first unpack and understand the worldview, which is exactly what you just described. There is a God. God is beneficent. God recognizes our problems, and God will, through various different things, various different practices, God is willing to share power, and you learn how to do that. So those are a simple understanding of a paradigm. However, when you're looking at the paradigms on page 566, just the little purple, short list, and they talk about creations divine and alive, or they talk about divine order and earthly chaos. Both of those may be terms that you could use to reference the viewpoint that you just described. They can also be used to describe the viewpoint of a Reiki practitioner. The idea of divine order and earthly chaos is very sensible to a Reiki practitioner. Creations divine and alive might also work, because they have this attitude and idea that the world is built of chi, the world is built of life force moving in various different states. And the movement of that chi in the proper fashion through various different practices is what allows you to do healing. That's actually at the foundation of philosophy for shiatsu. Reiki borrows that, but it also borrows from faith healing. It also borrows from Christianity. It's suggested, if not outright confirmed, that Master Usui was Christian. And so the idea that Jesus could lay on hands because he was the chosen son of God, and then others who follow in his steps can also hands, probably inspired him in some fashion, in which case there's a faith element to it as well. You're not going to, in this particular list of things, you're not going to run into other kinds of mechanics with all of this. You're not going to run into mechanistic cosmos, because while you could see the structures and patterns of chi as being slightly mechanistic, they're usually more organic than that. And so it's a little too organic for that particular view.
So if I were to try and then magify the shiatsu practice, I would say My paradigm is that chi is present in the universe, that chi is manipulable and modifiable, and through interfacing with it, it is possible to change the world around me. My practice of that is going to be a set of experiments and learned teachings in the manipulation of chi, which I may simplify to energy work, just to use a very broad term, or to body work, which is going to be a messy term because it doesn't perfectly map onto chi. And then my instrument is going to be that physical contact with a person or near physical contact to manipulate chi in such a way that they are healed. Interestingly, in both of these cases, we have gotten to the same life 3 effect, but in fundamentally different ways. If I believe that God has lost favor in me because I have done something, my character who does faith healing will lose access to that power. My shiatsu practitioner will not. On the flip side, if a shiatsu character believes that they are in an area where the laws of chi have fundamentally been changed, they may feel that they cannot practice their magic, where the faith healing character says, this is fine, God is always present.
And that's actually where you get into unpacking the concepts of mystical and metaphysical paradigms in general. When I teach this to my students, I always kind of break them into the idea of there are 2 fundamental questions you have to answer first. So the first question that you have to answer is, does your paradigm operate under the understanding of a supernatural or not? Meaning, is what you do natural, or is what you do beyond natural, the sphere of nature? Shiatsu is a natural practice. This is something that is built into the biology of every human. It's a form of body work. It's based on Chinese medicine. It's based on Japanese massage techniques, based around their medical practices. So that's what it is. So it's natural. There's no supernatural about it. And so if something changes the fundamental nature, it's not going to work the same way. Whereas the faith healing idea is supernatural. It draws upon the idea that there is a force outside of nature that is not subject to its laws, in some way able to interface with nature and intervene. And that's the first foundational question you have to ask.
Okay, so we've walked through this basic framework. Rune, could you give us an example of a Western occult or mystery practice that we can go through the same process with?
We're going to do witchcraft because I'm good at it. So we're going to start.
I witch good.
Yes, I am good broom. So we work with that. Starting with the foundational principles. Many witches and I'm going to speak from the perspective of American witchcraft because I'm American and I've never lived in any other countries. So I'm going to go with that. So please understand that most of what I'm talking about is the way that witchcraft is taken from an American perspective, even if that's not where it originated, and it is not. So the most common standpoint on this is witchcraft is the veneration of and the interaction with the mysteries of nature.
Is nature there a capital N thing? Like what is nature mean here?
Well, and that changes. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you, because witchcraft in Europe is not the same. So mostly what you're dealing with is nature paganism, the idea of veneration of the changing of seasons, veneration of the cycles of life and death, veneration of the organic process and biological processes. Many metaphors that are used by modern witches are nature-oriented, which is, say, trees, birth, and so they deal with the male and female sacred figures, the goddess and the god, and their relationship to us are these great big analogies, these great big allegorical figures of the quintessential mother, the quintessential grandmother, the crone, the wise old lady, and she's the goddess who represents the powers of death and dying, but also wisdom and all this other stuff. So there's this really life-oriented kind of attitude about it. So in that way, yes, nature. They don't venerate the forces of gravity. They don't venerate the forces of electromagnetism, but they do see them as signs of the sacred. They interact with the romantic symbolism, the poetic symbolism of snow, of the ocean, of the sky and the stars. They don't really go into the sun as a big ball of gas.
Let me try and paradigmify this. And I will say that within this, at least what you've laid down so far, the paradigm is there are cycles in nature, and that recognition of these cycles allow us access to symbols that are very powerful. There are also a set of opposing forces, dichotomies, and symmetries in nature that also unto themselves can give us access to power that allows us to change the world.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And anybody playing a mage with the foundational principles of modern witchcraft in America would actually probably use that. So they would probably want to work with something. And I don't like to use just the book headings for paradigms. I make up my own and then I define them myself. And that's usually like a 3-page thing.
The book headings specifically say we are literally trying to encapsulate all world practices within a few pithy headlines, which cannot be done. We've laid down 2 paradigmatic beliefs. What are other additional ones that you can think of that maybe certain strains of witchcraft or certain related strands of witchcraft would be? Like, one of the ones that I think of is there are elements of nature that exist but are hidden. And I would modify that to there are entities. So my character that wants to interact with elves and dwarves and gnomes and dryads and nymphs and sylphs. I feel like that needs to be built into a paradigm at some point.
The modern witchcraft focus on nature is because we are so estranged from it in our civilization now. Like, modern American and Western civilization and culture tend to be more insulated from nature because we have the use of electricity, good health care, and all this kind of stuff. So things that were understood in the 1500s, things that were understood like through the Dark Ages back before Christ, those particular understandings are gone now because we live differently. We have less fear of smallpox because we have vaccination now. We have less fear of the dark because we have lights that are on all day long.
But that's an interesting thing in that you're saying there are strains of witchcraft that are merely positing that these are natural forces that are entirely natural,
Yes.
that we have simply lost contact with. But there are other groups that also say there are phenomena as of yet and entities unclassified by science. And that is something that your character paradigmatically is going to have to say this or that.
Well, and here's the thing. So this is the way I handle mage. Mage has an objective reality. It's just a very malleable. Like, the Umbra exists. So the paradigms, the magical paradigms, which interface with the sphere in general, however you're going to do it, they're right. They are correct. Regardless of whether the mage in question does anything with the spirit sphere, does anything with the crossing into the Umbra or not, the Umbra still exists. Mm-hmm. And they can argue it however they like, but they don't have the power to change all of reality. And that is the whole point of mage. You're not the god of this world, just someone who recognizes that it's more malleable than others. Sleepers don't have an initiation into a mystery, which then grants them the power to edit reality, whereas mages do. And that is the primary foundational difference between a paradigm of belief for a sleeper and a paradigm of belief for a mage. A paradigm of belief for a mage is about the initiatory experiences that they have that allow them to manipulate the world and be more interactive with the hidden side of it. So, on the subject of the elves and fairies and things, many witchcraft traditions in England, in Northern and Western Europe in general, but also over into Eastern Europe, are actually built not upon the veneration of nature because that was a given, but rather upon the veneration of the powers behind nature. So the old spirits, the old ways, the old gods. So the idea was you still had the division between that one question, which I first prefaced, the one of two, wherein is your paradigm supernatural or natural? If you're dealing with most of those traditions, they thought that there was no difference between natural and supernatural. So they would be considered and classified as a natural tradition. The idea that, for example, Norse philosophy, Old Norse paganism, basically, not paganism, but like Old Norse heathenry, they believed that mountains could bleed. If you had the right weapon and you happened to have the right power, you could stab a mountain and make it bleed. You could stab a and make it bleed. All of their explanations of the storm giants, the frost giants, Alfar, all of these beings are living flesh beings, and their biology is just different from ours. So when a giant dies, he forms into a great big mountain. So that's where that mountain came from, the corpse of a dead giant. The idea was there's no difference between the super powerful beings like the Aesir and the Vanir or a human. They're just different biologically. They might be more mighty because they're more elemental. They might be wiser because they have access to greater lore, or they have a supernatural power that lets them see the world. But it's not really supernatural. It's just part of what they are. God didn't mean deity. It meant goodly. And these are powerful, goodly forces.
They looked at a human and they looked at a elf the same way we looked at a human and we looked at a dog. where a dog can run faster and do these other things. Those are not supernatural powers. They fall naturally out of its biology.
Right. Likewise, actually, a better way to look at it would be like, this is the case with most fairy faiths. So we're talking Norse, Irish, Welsh, all kinds of different things, British. Their idea was that the fairies that you encounter, like specifically the elves, if you're talking about the Norse and the Welsh, the Sidhe, if you're talking about the Irish, these beings are sort of more like aliens. And in fact, in Wales, they had stories of cows being turned inside out and people being abducted and losing time a lot earlier, like hundreds and hundreds of years before anybody started talking about the Greys and flying saucers. And so the idea was, in order for you to interact with fairies, to interact with elves, say, you have to cross the hedge, which is the allegorical boundary between the mortal world that they see and the real world, which is much bigger. And this is not a new concept. This is all over the world. It's behind the concept of samsara and the Maya in India. It's everywhere. The idea is the veil must be parted.
So paradigmatically, we are now adding the additional statements of, one, there are realms beyond the reality that we see. And two, there are ways of accessing that reality that can be done if you know the right rituals, rites, actions, state of mind, whatever, to transcend that.
And all of that in Mage is classified under the spirit sphere.
So we have outlined a bunch of elements of paradigm. And we've said, here's the basic witchly paradigm, that there are these natural cycles, that they can be invoked for power, that humans have the ability in some way to access them, that there is a power to symmetry and dichotomy that can also be symbolically directly accessed. And then also this optional thing where we say there may be other worlds and they may operate by these rules, and your character could take it or leave it. Now, the next step is then practice. And again, this is going to be a bit fuzzy. What would you say the foundational practices are of witchly belief in the traditions with which you are familiar, and how they interface or flow from paradigm?
All witchy faiths, like all witchcraft, is someone with the know, aka a witch, someone with the initiation and powers of witchery, does a thing to replicate the mysteries. That's some sort of ritual practice. The tools that they use, the practices that they go through, are all about replicating that. And by replicating that, they bring that force or that concept into manifestation. For example, witches venerate holidays, and witches have been venerating weird holidays that don't have anything to do with your modern calendar for a really, really long time. And I'm not talking about, they haven't celebrated the exact same holidays. So we're not talking like, well, everyone has celebrated the Wiccan cycle of the year, the whole Wheel of the Year thing, the Halloween and Christmas were originally Samhain and Yule and all this kind of stuff. That's modern neo-paganism. That's their interpretation of this. What we're talking about is Rudemas and Candlemas were celebrated by witches, sometimes as a sort of tongue-in-cheek, this is our way of venerating this Catholic holiday. And in other ways, this is their kind of like, this is our way of mocking that holiday. It depends on where you were at. And it depends on how enamored of the church the particular witchcraft body was. But by replicating certain rituals that are associated with that time, for example, the Beltane rites of Ireland, where you would place a giant pole in the ground and then tie ribbons on it and do like an English Maying and so on and so forth, where you would celebrate by having sex in the woods and all this kind of stuff, which is very reconstruction of something that may have or may not have been practiced in history.
What is Maying?
So where you choose a May Queen and you go through, it's basically like prom for May. And there's like, it's a ritual, but it's also just kind of a pageant. What you're doing is through all of the different pageantry and all the different actions, you're replicating the awakening and quickening of life in the world to create the tide of spring. And you can replicate that and call upon the tide of spring to bless your entire community for a year.
So the practice is then going to invoke some sort of simulacrum or some sort of microcosm, macrocosm in terms of saying, there's this force I want to access. I'm going to do a thing that looks like it. Or at a time where this is particularly top of mind, that is going to be the point through which magic is going to flow.
Yes, and actually the difference in that, again, comes back to the natural versus supernatural paradigm. Supernatural paradigm says this is veneratory and we're supplicating. And so then the gods may answer us or they may not. And then natural says we're harmonizing ourselves with those natural currents. And so, of course, they're going to flow through us so long as we keep the channel proper. All witches practice in this form. They replicate the mysteries that they have personally been initiated into through practice, through actions, through various ritual actions, and translate that into reality. Some people will perform religious rites to do this. For example, they will supplicate to gods. They will communicate with spirits. Others will interact with spirits, but not in a religious fashion, more of a camaraderie kind of thing. Others will not work with spirits at all, but will work with metaphorical. They'll tie everything to the element of fire, which as an allegorical symbol, they will use as a symbol of virility, of passion, of power. And so they will do things that are passionate. They will do things that are powerful and virile and aggressive to simulate the esoteric aspects of fire, to conjure it, to channel it into their ritual. All witches do it that way because in the end, a witch's power comes from the witch and her ability to interact with the world, not from the tools she uses, although those tools do have power. And there's a totally different thing, which we will talk about in a minute, I'm sure.
Okay. So it sounds like what you're setting up is, this is, to hopefully not be insulting, but this is almost high ritual magic, just without the scholastic abstractions.
Correct.
This is a mystery, nature-oriented version of that, or alternatively, high ritual magic is just a abstract, removed scholastic version of these practices. So if you could, can you give me some examples of what this might look like?
So let's continue with Beltane. We'll go with that one still. To create the connections that you would do. Most Beltane poles have 3 colors of ribbon, and traditionally you use 2 of them and maybe 1 of the third color, but they're red and white or red, white, and green. But the colors represent something. So the red represents the red of menstrual blood and the thereby quickening of fertility within a female body. The white represents ejaculation of semen, the quickening of fertility in a male body. And then the green represents the nature, like the powers of nature. Or the black represents the dark expanse of the soil. Or the red represents the birthing bloods, and the white represents the purity of newness and new life, and the black represents the powers of death. It depends on who you're talking to, but they will use color to create the symbolism and the connection. They will obviously use religious iconography and such, like a statue of a goddess or a pole that's carved with sacred symbols that describe a story or connect in some fashion.
So let's stick with a very simple thing. I am looking to bless the operations of my chantry in the upcoming year. We literally have a grove of trees, of fruit trees that we tend, or maybe some other fruit or vegetable that is important to our annual practice. And I want to make sure that that crop is a good one and that bounty is protected. Life. Yes.
Okay, so we're talking a life effect, maybe a prime effect, possibly a spirit effect, and definitely maybe a touch of entropy to avoid bad luck.
I want to cast the level 4 wizard spell of good crop. In this paradigm, what are some of the practices I can get there, and what are the instruments going to be to get to that effect?
In a paradigm that is supernatural, so we're assuming that we're dealing with otherworldly beings, and so bad luck and disease and things might be related to bad spirits and so on and so forth. You're dealing with a supernatural paradigm, or at least a paradigm that traffics with otherworldly beings. You would want to ensure that that space was set aside properly and properly purified so that it was a sacred space for the powers that you're working with, which means sacred symbolism of some sort. Your tradition will have some sort of sacred symbols. If you're dealing with a verbena who's doing this, like nature symbolism is generally what you work with. You take like twigs and create them and craft them, twist them into like symbols of some sort, you know, like an effigy of a deity or a big pentagram, or even just circles. You might make a breed's cross. Those things are traditional folk symbols of apotropaic magic. They're meant to ward away evil, and they're meant to create positive space wherever they create a perimeter. So you hang them in the 4 directions being a very common symbolic reference. The card points are often used for a lot of different things, for space, setting space, but also representative of different sacred powers that exist outside the sphere of the world but influence it. So you're talking earth, air, fire, water. That's hermeticism at its best right there. So you set the space. You start setting your space. Then you're going to go through a different process, like a process of making the space, like inviting the powers that will make the change you want. You go in and you call to your deities, supplicate. If you aren't using deities, if you look at this as all a natural thing, that's a different paradigm and we would have to look at it a different way. But you call upon the powers of spring and summer and banish winter from your space. You're trying to make things grow well. You want to keep winter in its place and not here. So winter is the place of blight. So you want it to be gone from the space. You could invite fairies that are particularly helpful for life and, for growth and things. You could also do sacrificial practices. For example, you could make a little talisman out of an apple, stuff it with some herbs and bury it in the ground. The herbs are beneficent and special and sacred. And you bury it in the ground so that the ground, you inter forces into earth that will purify it and make it grow. The way you translate those things into like an actual enchantment generally means you're going to go to the stuff that needs to be enchanted, like your trees, and you're going to apply stuff to tree. So you're going to braid a cord that is in the sacred colors and tie it with sacred herbs and then wrap it around the tree. You're going to bury things down at the roots of the tree, not just in the ground itself. You're going to hang things from the branches of the trees. You're going to mix up a special potion, and then you're going to use your spoon to spatter it all over the tree and water the roots. There's all kinds of different ways you could go about doing that enchantment.
Okay, so this is a case, though, where we have one paradigm that we went over before about invocation of forces and there being a symmetry to nature, and there are ways for humans to access that. We've gone over maybe two different practices, one regarding entreating with spirits, the other being the direct manipulation of things that are symbolic of these forces. And you've already listed a half dozen instruments, specific ways. So we've gotten to the same place 5 or 6 different ways, and all of them legitimate, and
all of them connected, in fact. I've always found it rather funny when you design your character and you have to pick, 7 different practices and then like tools associated with that?
You picked between 7 and 11 of them. Yeah.
Right, so some number. But anyways, I've always been like, one of my friends, we were designing characters together for a game, and she says, I always get stuck with the practices. And I was like, why would you get stuck with the practices? The practices are easy. She goes, yeah, but I don't know which ones I want to do. There don't seem to be enough options. And I started laughing. I was like, I had the exact same problem. I'm like, I do all of the things. Can I just do all of them? Except for these ones. These ones don't mix with my paradigm. And unfortunately, we had to limit our list. So my character did not know herbalism, even though it made perfect sense for him as a student of folklore to know herbalism.
That's what it is. One paradigm, one practice, and no fewer than 7 instruments.
Yes. And I've always been like, I was always like, I can list at least 3 practices, and then like, don't even ask me about tools. I will use everything.
So I'm a math dork. I want to replace the term paradigm with axiom, just assumptions you make about how the world operates. Practice is then the framework, and instrument is the way you implement that framework. And that's my thought about it.
Well, I would say axiom should be used for the tenets that are associated with that paradigm. Like, your paradigm has a heading, and that's the name for your paradigm. These are my lenses. And then you have axioms associated with that and tenets that are explanatory of those axioms.
Yeah, you have one paradigm, but it is made up of many axioms or tenets. I like that. So we've done a walkthrough for, in this case, witchcraft, and you've done a run-through. Do you want to do a quick run-through of maybe instruments that maybe fit within that practice and paradigm that may work with different spheres? Like, how are you going to cross... Let's talk about some common effects. How are you going to cross the gauntlet? How are you going to move real fast from point A to point B? How are you going to curse someone? And how are you going to light their ass on fire? The basics of mage.
How do you cross the gauntlet as a witch? Witches will probably, depending on who you're dealing with, if you're dealing with a verbena witch, you're dealing with life magic, and you're dealing with the idea of the living world. You're dealing with the powers of living nature and their mighty spiritual aspects. So you're going to want to step through a bend of trees, like a hollow. You're going to want to lay a circle in, like, on the ground with like leaves or something to that effect. Step in and then make a portal on one side of that circle and step out. You're going to want to cross a river. You're going to want to use natural formations to do it, caves and so on. If you are a hollower who is very much a fan of old poetry and so on and so forth, you're going to do what the old fairy stories from England used to say. So you're going to run around a building counterclockwise 3 times and then go in. Kevin Andrew Murphy used that as one of his ways of entering the Umbra in Silver Nutmeg Golden Pear or something of that effect. You're going to want to step through a looking glass. You're going to want to use something prosaic and from like literature.
That is interesting because you bring up the Hollower philosopher, and I think the Hollow Ones have arguably the messiest paradigm. The Hollow Ones and the Sons of Ether, to me, have the two messiest ones. So when you are doing those effects as a Hollower, is that a case where my paradigm is there is truth to the old stories?
Yeah, that's actually a good way to look at it. The thing is, with Hollowers versus like one of the 9 mystic traditions, Hollowers can replicate anything so long as it's romantic, so long as it's got a kind of romance to it and it inspires their poetic soul. I mean, they're the goth kids. So, and now they're not the goth kids only, but they're a lot, like they're still kind of run by the goth kids. So,
well, that's the interesting thing though, because in first edition, the Hollow Ones were just another name for orphans. In 2E, sure, they were the up and comers and still orphans. And they were kind of working with the discarded. In Revised, it exploded into the postmoderns, the romantics, and the gutter mages.
Yes.
As the 3 subfactions. And now in M20, it seems mostly to be Gothic postmoderns.
That works. I would say romantic postmodernists would work better. Gothic just being the primary ones in charge because like the elders of the Hollowers are all very like morbid.
What then is the paradigm tenant that allows me to do that magic for them?
The Verbena has an orthodoxy associated with their practice that is centered around the mysteries of life, the nature, and so on and so forth, that the Hollower could give 2 shits about. The Hollower says the stories that these particular concepts are around are inspiring to me. They make me think that there is more life in this world, beauty in this world, than is commonly seen in the trashy bullshit. And so I'm going to use that.
So the paradigm then becomes, I am capable of great things with inspiration, and the practice then becomes story emulation.
Yes, that's actually great. I like to refer to the Hollowers as the Pulp Fiction version of the other 9 traditions.
I have difficulty with true postmodernism in Mage because by definition, postmodernism is a skepticality of the notion of paradigm.
Yes.
So like how
Which
the fuck
is obnoxious.
Yeah. And likewise, I have a problem. The Sons of Ether have the opposite problem where they say, no, all beliefs are true, and it is the goal of us to find the truth in all beliefs. And how they became technomancers is a weird quirk of history, but like yes, I can see an alternative version of them where the Sons of Ether and the Akashics almost switch positions. But that's neither here nor there.
If they switch places with the choristers.
Yes. Yeah, there are so many ways to take it. They can have this almost Gnostic view that if we transcend this temporal boundary that we can do great things. This episode is never going to end. So let us move on to, I am a witchcraft practitioner and I would like to cast a fireball or a large elemental invocation. What would make sense thematically and how do I do it?
If you are a witch, and I'm going to just focus on the real world witches, you can translate this into, are they verbena, are they orphan, are they hollower, are they what? By the way, witches could conveniently be verbena, dream speakers, hollow ones. Conveniently. Witchcraft could easily fall into them. They can slightly less conveniently also fall into the ecstatic practices of the cult of ecstasy, but only slightly less conveniently. It's inconvenient to try to convert them into an ormies. It's almost impossible to try to convert them into anything associated with ether, because again, they're a messy paradigm, as you were saying. But also because technomancy is not a commonly embraced witchy paradigm. You can be a techno witch, but that's its own thing. And then you're going into VA, Sons of Ether, and orphans of various other different kinds. Okay, moving on. So back to your question, how do I do a fireball? What you're going to do here is, if you are a witch, the common methods in tradition, like across lore associated with witchcraft, to cast a hex upon someone, to call upon a powerful force to attack them. We're assuming you're in person. You're going to be speaking some sort of an incantation. You're going to be looking at them with your witch's evil eye. You're going to be making hand gestures and thing in your hand, maybe, based on your practices. So you could conceivably buffet them with like the power of a storm by holding some heather in your hands. You could hold those in your hands and you could blow it at them, and then they get hit by something. You could speak a great, like a long, lengthy poem, a stanza wherein, lightning struck the person. It's from some sort of like, classic poem. If you're going from the classics, you speak that. Or you could speak a liturgy from some sort of like body of lore that you're working with. Like speak the incantation that you use to call the Guardian of the East, which is commonly associated with wind. Or speak an old Akkadian weather chant. But you're using your own body, because most witches are very body oriented. Their hands, their breath, their spit, their blood, which is why the verbena are so blood oriented. That's how you're going to cast that particular spell. If you are not in the same space as them, you're going to do this in a ritual space of some sort. You're going to have set aside a space, just like I was talking about, create a perimeter. You're going to use some effigies of the subject. You're going to stab them with a knife. You're going to set the thing on fire. You're going to drown something in water, that kind of thing. That's how you lay the elementals upon them. You use elemental forces through physical tools, fire, water, metal, that kind of stuff. And then you apply it to your simulacrum.
You introduce the idea of an effigy as an instrument. That, to me, introduces, a paradigm element that says something like, I can affect a thing by affecting a thing that looks like the thing.
Yes. It's a common principle of sympathetic magic. Like, sympathetic magic is the key to almost all of their magic. So the Emerald Tablet has it said that Hermes Trismegistus, who, by the way, was a magician, not a god. That wasn't Hermes or Thoth. That was a magician who was dedicated to both. Hermes Trismegistus, when explaining the mysteries of magic, he said that the first and biggest tenet was as above, so below, and then he wouldn't explain the others. His lips were tightly sealed. That's where we get the term hermetically sealed. Anyways, so as above, so below literally means as this small thing looks like I'm doing this one thing, so that actually happens. That's going to be crucial to all forms of spellcasting. You're going to run into that everywhere. It really is very simple to do magic.
I feel like the idea of sympathy is like kind of the unstated major premise of a lot of magic. And until I just started adding that to almost every paradigm, there always felt like there was this gap between, okay, I think these things exist in the world, but how do I dick around with them? And the idea of sympathetic magic is almost a necessity unless you posit some other set of mystical physics principles to kind of let you actually change the world.
When you deal with the laws of sympathy and what do in modern Western occultism as the laws of contagion, which has to do with a thing that has touched a thing is connected to. So like your tooth is still connected to you, so I can use it against you. If I have some of your shoelaces, I can affect your shoes, which affect you, that kind of thing. It's the idea of law of contagion, law of sympathy. They're so intrinsic to practice of magic everywhere that like people get that not everybody knows about them, which I do believe may have made its way a little bit into Mage the Ascension, especially like in Mage 20, because those of us who practice the occult forget that there are people out there who don't know the things that we know, and so we kind of forget, that as above so below thing, nobody knows why a voodoo doll works, but we do. Maybe we should talk about that. But it would take too long.
Okay, so your goal is to establish a connection with the target and then to invoke a force which may be tied to a natural element or a fluid or aspect of your body. Makes
Correct.
sense.
Yes.
How does mind control work? Is that going to be a similar thing?
So in most forms of witchcraft, when you're dealing with influencing someone's mind, what you're really doing is influencing their behavior. You're trying to influence the motivators of their choices. Not necessarily like mind magic has its own set of principles and practices in the game. So telepathy, being able to hypercognate, be able to think quickly, the ability to implant suggestions, remove memories, all that kind of stuff. Modern witches don't like to talk about this practice because they consider it to be a fairly cruel practice. They don't like doing things. The ones who do practice it don't want to talk about it to the other people because they don't want to get ostracized from there. So it's harder for you to find like written down spells of how to do mental influence. Mm-hmm. Even though they exist, they're harder to practice. But the idea is the mental sphere, everything exists there and a whole lot of boundaries. Like everything there is symbolic. It's often referred to in some traditions as the astral plane, in some traditions as the mental plane. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. And it depends on who you're talking to. In some cases, it has to do with, again, connections of sympathy. For a witch, According to old Scottish lore, if you don't want a witch to cast spells on you, never cross your path. The moment she sets eyes on you and can identify you intimately herself, she can cast on you. Distance daunts neither a witch's sight nor her spells. So the method is going to be very similar, but tools, like, for example, many traditions use ligature, aka tying, in order to manipulate people. They cause people to obsess about certain kinds of things. So it's not as simple as I tell you to do something and then you do it. It's more of a, I make you think about this thing and not be able to stop thinking about it. And that makes you feel this certain thing and you can't stop feeling it. And so that makes you do this certain thing because this is the thing that you would do naturally.
Interesting. So that's not going to be a direct control of thought, but it may get you to the same place by forcing a thought pattern or a recurring set of ideas that then manifest in whatever results you want. So if I'm going into a set of negotiations and I want someone to be very nice to me or have a very positive opinion, what kind of thought pattern might I be setting up in that case to try and bring about that result that I want? Or if I want someone to tell me a secret.
Okay, so the first one, there are a lot of spells and people so that they're nice to you or they bend over. And in Western practice, so many folk remedies are actually hoodoo, so that's a thing. I apologize for those of you who are listening and are like, okay, but hoodoo is its own practice. Yes, I know. And I know that it is not witchcraft, and I know it's not the same thing, and I know that that doesn't matter to witches. So there are oils you can make that you put on your hands that when you shake someone's hand, they become more amenable to your persuasion. There are candles you can burn that are treated with certain herbs and oils that when they are burning during that period of time, if the person's name is carved into the candle, that influence is going to be sent at the subject. Their resistance is going to be weakened. There are incantations, and this is when we get into actual European witch lore. There are incantations, words that you can think, poems you can say in your mind while you're talking to somebody, that is very much like that art of desire practice, wherein by thinking those things in your mind while you're talking to them, kind of double talk, you can influence people's feeling. If you follow that whole art of desire thing, when you speak to people, the things that you are thinking are the things that they do. The words don't matter. If you have physical contact with them, your mental impulse is strong and it moves through the connection of.
And divulging a secret.
Divulging a secret to get someone to spill their lips. Here, I like to turn a little bit more toward some of the other practices of witchcraft, like the practices of stone magic and talismans and so on and so forth. You can craft a talisman enchant, an object like a little pouch full of herbs with like a root in it that coaxes people to confess the truth. For example, eyebright is commonly associated with seeing the truth. Deer's tongue is commonly associated with secrets, either keeping them or confessing them, and so on and so forth. So you might put something like that in there. A little like spice, like a cinnamon to loosen their tongue. You could get a blue lace agate or a clear quartz, and you could carry that with you. It's been enchanted, washed in holy water, so that only the words of truth can be heard by you. So, and like only the words of truth can be spoken near you, that kind of stuff. Talismans are another way you could do this. There are symbols that you can draw, like you lick your finger and draw on the table at the diner that you're at where you're going to meet with this person and you want them to tell you the truth. And so you draw that on the table and then you switch seats so that they sit down in that spot, and now that's impacting them. There are all kinds of different ways to do it.
Okay, so it seems to be that there is also a second kind of either practice or paradigm assumption that the properties that something has in regards to one sense transfers to another. And what is that called?
Well, I mean, we're still dealing with the idea of sympathy, but specifically that comes from Western thought and early classical Hermeticism, the idea of doctrine of signatures, the idea that something does a thing because it resembles a thing, like something affects a thing because it looks like it, like digitalis has heart-shaped leaves, and so foxglove can be distilled into heart medication, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, just so we're clear. We already know that. That's a scientific thing, but in magic, it's still very true. So blue lace agate is blue. It's a very pretty, like, lighter blue. Clear quartz is clear, and so those both have associations with clarity, and with blue is occasionally associated with communication because of the throat chakra. And so if you have a blue stone that's been enchanted for clarity, that might. I'm just drawing from like a body of
Okay.
studied over the years. So
Now, the last one is, how do I get from point A to point B real fast as a witch?
okay, witches don't teleport. They turn into the wind. Okay, so in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, they brought that up. They made a point where Spike, I think, was the one, or no, Anya was the one who said, witches don't teleport, they turn into the wind. Well, that makes sense. They don't have the same kind of spatial relation that, like, other kinds of beings do. So a witch isn't likely to teleport. She's likely to do something similar or something else. If you're talking about just like swift transportation from one place to another, a witch might swing a broom over her head 3 times. Broom being associated with a number of different kinds of powers, possibly associated with weather manipulation as well, if you follow Germanic traditions. And she might turn herself into a cyclone and fly away. She might turn herself into the wind and blow out of the house and then reconstitute herself somewhere else. It's less of a, how do I do this? And more like, what does it look like? Like the effect is the same. It's just the shape that happens.
Or close to the same. You wouldn't be able to instantaneously get from point A to point B, but you would be able to move at the speed of the wind, which is pretty darn fast and close enough to teleportation in a lot of cases.
Right. Or a witch who is enamored of classics of other kinds might step through a mirror, might jump into a pool of water and appear like on another pool of water kind of a thing, might use some sort of naturally formed gateway. And then there's that whole storyline in the Verbena book where they talked about the silver trods and the paths of the wick and how to travel the world swiftly, kind of a thing, and safely.
That seems to bring up another paradigmatic idea, that all things of a given type are related, that all water is in some way connected and all mirrors are in some way connected. Mm-hmm. What is that an embodiment of, or is there a term for that idea?
It's still associated with that same as above so thing, except the specific idea is an extrapolation of the Law of Contagion, the idea that all forests are one forest. Mercedes Lackey used that for 500 Kingdoms novels. All shadows go to the same place, and so therefore they can be used as gateways. All reflections are the same. The idea is, if it looks like it, it is it. And therefore, if it is it, it's connected to all the other stuff. There you go. And that's really common in most forms magic. I mean, the Hermetics are far more likely to do that. The Order of Hermes is far more likely to apply that kind of stuff because they've codified all that and written it all down.
Which is interesting because that to me is almost a Platonic notion or a logically positivist notion that all actual representations of a thing are tied to that representation that exists somewhere else. You brought up the idea that witches don't teleport, and one of my favorite questions for someone who's building a character is, what can't your character do? Within a traditional witch paradigm, as you have laid out, let's add the supernatural element in maybe. What are things a character simply isn't going to be able to do?
Okay, things that witches are not likely to be able to.
And this is bog standard witch. This is just the standard witch that you have outlined so far. This is not someone maybe pulling in addition to Eastern European folklore, or maybe not looking at the Hollower tradition, but just using the principles you've outlined so far of Western contemporary witchcraft. What will that character not be able to do, almost regardless of sphere level?
Of course, the first one are going to be able to teleport. Witches are highly unlikely to be able to time travel, although they will likely be able to figure out ways to manipulate time, but not likely to do time travel where they go back in time and go forward in time and so on and so forth. It's just not a thing. They talk about traveling and then time is irrelevant, but then it's going to be more like a fairy travel. You know, like they traveled in the Umbra for a while in Fairyland and they ended up traveling for 7 days, but they came back and it was 49 years. That kind of travel, maybe. And maybe they can go back, but it's going to be more about the road than it is going to be about the effect. Nearly everything that a witch does is almost always going to have an element of personal intimacy and arousal. So she's not likely to do spells like a computer program. She's not just going to be, say a couple words and then that's enough. She's got to have a thing behind it. There's an emotional arousal that happens in all witchcraft. And spells don't work unless you have some way of being a conduit for the powers, and that's usually an ecstatic practice. Almost all of the older magics have an ecstatic practice when they have to do with magic, like having your own.
Is there a witch notion of either returning from the dead, or what would Witch Gilgul, the destruction of the Avatar, be like? Is that notion of a soul there?
Okay, yes, in some traditions, and no others.
Okay, so it may be possible that a witch may not be able to directly attack the avatar of another entity.
Well, the concept of an avatar is different amongst witches. They probably would not call it an avatar, and they probably wouldn't describe it the way that avatars are described. They would probably describe it as like a daemon. You're dealing with the idea that there is a tutelary spirit that's assisting them and associated with them in fashion. So they would not necessarily see it as being the same as their soul, see it as being like their tutelary spirit. They would see it as being something they're connected to and not necessarily the same as them.
Which is interesting because now this allows for a much more explainable notion of an avatar lineage of saying, oh, of course, these 5 people were all taught by the same spirit being. It is obvious that they are related. Okay. What about raising the dead? Proper resurrection, not just like making a zombie.
That's not really foreign to witchcraft. There are a bunch of stories of bringing life back to the dead and bringing them to life. And this is actually far more commonly seen in paradigms that have a larger natural than supernatural impact. The idea that you breathe life back into the dead and they wake up from their sleep.
Which almost makes sense, because if there is no other place, then there isn't this notion of a loss of spirit or something like that. The body's here. The only thing we need is to get it working again. So
right. Although in traditions that do acknowledge otherworldly places but don't see them as outside of nature, the trip from there to here is not far.
Okay.
And a great many witchcraft traditions actually are involved with the idea of intercession between death. Eastern and Northern European witch lore often ties itself to a death and rebirth figure of some sort. Specifically, you'll run into them all over the place. Odin and Hel and Holda and Perchta from the Norse traditions, Ceridwen from Wales and Ireland. You'll run into them a lot. And all of them associate with the idea that life, when it dies, it sleeps under the roots of the world and can be pulled right back from where it is to brought back into the world. The terms associated with the word witch, wick, Vitke, all of them have association of life force. A lot of classical witchcraft lore comes from the idea of talking things to life. That's how your spells work. You basically animate them. So resurrection is a very common one for witches. Have all kinds of concepts of defying death kind of a thing, but they often have weird little rules about it. Like if you're of the lineage where your patron is Godfather Death, hood, the robe, skeleton face kind of a thing, scythe, Godfather Death has rules. You cannot heal someone who he has specifically chosen to die. Anyone else is fair game, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so your particular embodiment may have specific sub-restrictions. So it is not necessarily something that witchcraft can't do, but your practice may have some narrower exceptions that you won't be able to do.
And I always tie those to a paradox when I'm STing. When I do storytelling for a game, if a person has violated, if they've done magic that is not in line with their gods or whatever, I punish them based on their gods, not based on some, textbook Bane spirit that shows up.
So you bring up 2 things, and before we wind down, the 2 things I would like are, so my first question is, what are some recommendations you have for how paradox should manifest for a witch?
For a witch, paradox should manifest based on her relationship with, for example, if she's a forces mage, and she's done a spell to send the power of a storm to strike down her enemy. Mm-hmm. Electricity should not like her. Maybe she riled it up too much, and so everything she touches gets zapped. And electronic appliances break and all this kind of stuff. And you just aggravate it more until eventually she has a little mini storm that follows her around and fucks things up because she hasn't put it to rest yet. If you're dealing with like life magic, I don't like the grotesquerie that a lot of people get into with life magic. And I don't really feel it has a place in all paradigms. So like, I'm not a person who's like, oh, she grows fur face or her nails grow to 6 feet long or any bullshit like that. Sometimes that's appropriate. But not always. If she's done a spell to heal somebody, and what she's done is called upon the spirit of spring, then where she goes, flowers will bloom. That is going to be a thing. It's going to start becoming a very obvious thing, which will attract paradox and cause her to develop like the inability to be subtle about her magic. She needs to go figure this shit out. If you're dealing with someone who's based on Wicca, they have that whole Law of 3 thing. If you've done a spell to hex somebody, bad shit starts happening to you, misfortune and bad luck and so on and so forth, because you violated the Law of 3, that kind of thing. If you're of a different kind of lineage, like a fairy faith, where your magic works through the intercession of fairy spirit, you do the thing, and then the very next day, if you have missed your offer to say thank you, without actually saying thank you, because don't do that to fairies. It's just pieces of fairy lore. Then they start fucking with your house. They start doing all kinds of nasty little things. It depends on your particular paradigm and what effect you are trying to produce. But all vulgar effects have logical conclusions. So you just have to kind of look at it and go, okay, this is what's happening to you.
Okay. And then my last one is, so we have talked about this tradition of North American witchcraft. For people who are like, this is interesting, but what are some of the other places that this goes that may be similar to it? What resources or ideas can you recommend where it's like, hey, this is what it looks like here, but around the world, maybe it's different. Or here's a odd corner that is considered a distant branch of this practice that you may not think of as being part of witchcraft, but in some way actually is.
Okay, so I would recommend a couple of things. When you're trying to kind of create background for your campaign based on, witch lore and so on and so forth, buying encyclopedias are usually a good way to do it, but only if they're well written. Folklore collections, those are good places to go. For example, I really encourage people to buy if they're going to do a lot of spirit lore, I encourage them to buy like an almanac on angels and an almanac on spirits, that kind of thing, and like unpack those before they really start doing it. Because spirits are identities, they're beings. If you're going to play with like paradigms, like worldviews and things, and you're going to try to shape your umbra to look like a pagan paradigm, then go read a book on it. And there are lots of different books out there. For more outre witch practices and so on and so forth, I wouldn't know where to begin if you haven't already educated yourself on standard stuff in your local area.
My final one is, how, if someone is doing their homework, can they kind of sniff out some of the things that may have historical backing versus the bullshit?
Okay, so this is actually my favorite piece to play with here. This is one of my favorite soapboxes to stand on. It doesn't matter whether it's historical or not. If it works, it works. And that has always been how witches have believed. But if you are trying to find something in history, if you're trying to sort something out and like use something that is historically accurate because you're trying to reference a point in history, you're going to have to do a lot of scholastic research. You're going to have to do a lot of research, and you must not trust a book written by witches for that subject, because historians and witches are different. People who wrote histories about witchcraft were not writing them so people could learn how to practice witchcraft. They were writing them so that people could learn how to avoid witches, or they would use them as propaganda to basically explain, this is why we killed them. Histories about witchcraft, histories about magic in general, are written by people who controlled the narrative on the subject. And that was never, ever practitioners of the occult. So you must never use histories as the basis of your spellcraft alone. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, if I can't use history as a guide, what can I use then?
Well, modern vernacular. Like, you can use modern books, you can use the things that people are practicing right now, but I will warn you, and this is a big thing, since we're just playing a game, it doesn't matter. Like, your game, this is historically accurate. In another person's reality, that's not. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. In the study of witchcraft in the real world, which is a different ball game entirely, the only way you know if magic is real is if you try it and it works. That's the only way. It's why I'm so experiential and so experimental when I deal with my occultism. And the results will vary on occasion, but when you're dealing with solid metaphysical principles, the results are verifiable in the same way that science. I always tell people that the practice of magic, and this is something that any of you players who are practicing, your characters are diligent and legit practitioners and not just kind of dabblers with superpowers. They're going to think like this. Magic is a profession, which means that it is one part science, meaning you ask questions and use methodology that is rational to gain answers about your questions. It is one part art, which means that it is, you have a vision, you have an impulse, you have something inside of you brought out into the world, and then when it is experienced, it causes people to transcend their original thinking process, makes them ask new questions, makes them think differently. So you've got those two, and then one part philosophy, which is to say, I've learned stuff and I need to figure out how it all works. And so I'm going to put it together, and I'm going to have a running science and a running art associated with it. And I'm just going to, it's kind of an exchange between science and art and a constant conversation. All of those put together become a craft.
Nice. Is there any question you wish I had asked you, or more accurately, any closing thought or impression that you want to leave the listener with before we wind down?
Sure. I have one last little thing to remind everyone. So Mage the Ascension is not a handbook of magic. Mage the Ascension was based, lore and backdrop-wise, on metaphysical and occult traditions and practices that people knew about. Some they knew about less than they do now, some that they knew about quite a bit, and it doesn't matter. The connection between mage and real-life occultism is there. It is present. Mage is not those things, and that's good. There are no verbena, sorry. But you can use the tenuous connection to flesh out your campaign in a lot of different ways. Don't feel bad if you're like, well, the verbena aren't really factually accurate if we're looking at witches' history. Because they're not. They're close, but they're not. It doesn't matter. In this world, they are. And you can use the backdrop of real-world occultism to tell a story point. You can carry forward the idea of, okay, but the Wiccans have an alternative history, and they're kind of fake. Oh, they're fake because they were a failed craft tradition that derived from some verbena stuff. Come up with your own lore. Come up with your own idea. Don't get trapped into orthodoxy with all this, and don't get trapped into the idea of like empirically valid, because this is the world of darkness, not the same thing.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. And thank you for the fact that you have a Venn diagram that includes understanding of witchcraft and understanding of Mage the Ascension, which I don't know how common that is, but I'm super glad to have found it. If our listeners are interested in hearing more of your thoughts or have some questions, is there any place that they can reach out to you?
Yes. Okay. Primarily, I'm available through which is associated with the study of the occult, but also associated with role-playing games, because I do something called geekomancy. So this is actually very kind of similar to the things I was talking. You can find me at The Queen's Word, which is www.patreon.com/thequeensword. No hyphens or anything like that. You can also find me on Facebook, although I'm really hard to reach right now. I'm the only Rune Emerson on Facebook, so you can find me there. You can also find me on my blog at grimoireofgeekery.tumblr.com.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast, which reduces the difficulty of all lore rolls by 1. If you'd like to support us and get a cool chat color in Discord, go to magethepodcast.com and click on Become a Supporter of Mage the Podcast. This episode is made possible from the support of our executive producers, and they are Anders, Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Christopher P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Jenna F., Justin, John Magnuson, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, and William. My patron shout-out this week is to John Magnuson, or JMags, on the Discord, who wrote some Demon to V5 conversion rules after fighting off the addiction that is apparently TikTok. JMags wrote V5 rules for Demon, and his work I put some esteem in. It uses lores and not rotes, and it's in our show notes, and just may send your players screaming. From the fun! The link to John's work is available in our show notes. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choice via RSS. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing, or tell a friend about us. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast, and you can also give us your thoughts and feedback over email at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or at Twitter @matesthepodcast. Also go to matesthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Go change reality. Bye.